It takes courage to be crocus-minded. I'd rather wait until June. Like wild roses, when the hazards of winter are safely behind and I'm expected, and everything's ready for roses. But crocuses, highly irregular, knifing up through the hard frozen ground and snow, sticking their necks out because they believe in spring and have something personal and emphatic to say about it. I am not by nature crocus-minded. Even when I have studied the situation and know there are wrongs that need righting, affirmations that need stating, and know that my speaking out may offend, for it rocks the boat, well, I'd rather wait till June. Maybe things will work themselves out, and we won't have to make an issue of it. Forgive me, wrongs won't work themselves out. Injustices and inequities and hurt don't just dissolve. Somebody has to stick their neck out. Somebody who cares enough to think through and work through hard ground because they believe and they have something personal and emphatic to say about it. Me, crocus-minded? Could it be that there are things that need to be said and I need to say them? I pray for courage. Amen.
One of the first things that I learned about working in a church is that there are always some things that you seem to talk about endlessly without ever actually getting anything done. Have you noticed that? At the first church that I worked at, one of those things was bulletin boards. I cannot even begin to tell you the number of hours we spent in staff meetings talking about bulletin boards. The problem was, you see, we didn't have many. There were only 3 in the whole building, and 2 of those were in one of those hallways that no one ever goes into. The church had just built this snazzy new addition, and the folks who designed it had been loath to add any tacky bulletin boards to those smooth, modern, freshly painted walls. But it turns out that bulletin boards are useful, and we wanted that method of communication to be available. So we had long conversations about how we might be able to put in bulletin boards that didn't ruin the aesthetic. Perhaps they could have a little curtain that goes across, or little doors that could be closed when there were weddings or memorial services. Or maybe we could add just a couple of them and have really strict rules about what could and couldn't go on there. I worked at that church for 4 years. We never did get those bulletin boards. But I'm still on their mailing list, and so I have a sense of how this church is changing. And just this year, I saw an amazing piece of news in their newsletter. They now have brand new bulletin boards. It only took them 5 years after I left to finish those conversations. I guess that is what people mean by change at the speed of church. While it is often churches that get made fun of for being slow to change, the reality is that changing any institution takes time. Think about how hard it is to make a change as an individual. I remember that it took me 5 or 6 tries and nearly as many years to finally stop biting my nails. And only I had to make that decision. There are all kinds of theories out there about how many days or weeks you have to do something or not do something in order for it to become a habit. Some say it takes only a week. Others say you need at least 30 or 60 days. Now, multiply that by however many people are in a given institution. So here at this church, we've got probably 300 people who are active in different ways. Can any of you math whizzes calculate how long it will take before we all remember to, I don't know, for example, consistently call our preschool by the right name? Do you know it? It's Children's Winter Garden with White Wing School, and I forget at least 3 times a week. Anyone who has tried to lead change will tell you that moving a group of people from one way of being or doing to another can be like trying to bike uphill in the mud. It's slow, tedious, and can get pretty messy. For some, institutional change can feel like it is moving at a glacial pace. Other times, it feels like it's moving way too fast, and perhaps without our consent. One of the theories about why people experience change so differently from one another is called the diffusion of innovation, developed by Everett Rogers. Rogers says that change, like so many other things, works on a bell curve. And I think we have a visual bell curve. So you can look at that while I'm describing this. So on one end of the bell curve are the innovators, who are typically a very small part of the population of an organization, usually just about 2.5%. These are the people who actually come up with new ideas and invent new ways of doing things. You might say that they are the ones who plant the seeds, but they need the rest of us to water and tend those seeds for them to really grow. Now, right next to the innovators on that bell curve are 13.5% of people that Rogers calls the early adopters. These are people who can look at and evaluate possibilities quickly and are able to adapt to change with ease. You might classify these folks as the crocus-minded type, described in the poem that Dan shared. Early adopters are often well respected within organizations and are essential to making change. Now, after those early adopters, right, this big chunk in the middle, we get the early majority. These people make up about 34% of any organization. They pay attention to what those early adopters say and do, but it takes a little bit longer for them to make up their minds. If we want to stretch our garden metaphor a little further, you might say that these people are the tulips or daffodils. And here's the thing about the early majority. These are the key players in change. If you can't get any of the early majority on board, you might as well stop trying. The diffusion of innovation theory tells us that you need 20% of people, yes, only 20%, for a change to stick. However, the innovators and the early adopters only make up 16%. So they have to get at least 4% of the early majority on board to have any hope of success. Because of this, the border between the early adopters and the early majority on our bell curve, let's say 5 pipes in, is often called the chasm. If you want to effectively make change, you have to be able to leap that chasm. The other 50% of any organization fall into 2 categories, the late majority and the laggards. The late majority is another 34% of the population, and they tend to be kind of skeptical of change. Eventually, they'll go along with something new, but only once it has been proven to be worthy or successful. And finally, we get to the last 16%, and this is Everett's term for them, not mine, who he calls the laggards. These are the people who simply will not change. Organizations often make the mistake of pacing organizational change at the pace of the laggards, which means you never do anything. So I wonder, do you recognize yourself in any of these categories? Maybe in more than one of them? I know that I tend to be an early majority person, but that sometimes changes. In that bulletin board story, I was forced into the innovator category simply because of my role in the system. Other times, I found myself to be a late majority or even a laggard, especially if I have some kind of emotional investment in the change. So about a year and a half ago, my alma mater, Andover Newton Theological School, announced that they would be selling their beautiful campus in Newton Center and pursuing a partnership with Yale Divinity School. As you might imagine, there were a lot of people unhappy with this decision, me among them. Andover Newton was the first school that I had gone to where I thought that I might like to have a continuing connection to that school. Especially since I moved back to New England, I had thought that perhaps one day I would supervise interns from Andover Newton. Or maybe I'd have a chance to audit a class there through their program for area alums. Or maybe I would even teach a class there someday. So when they made their announcement, all of these dreams went out the window. Now, I've gone through many of the emotions typical of change in the last year and a half, starting with shock and disorientation, moving into anger and sadness. And I felt deeply the loss. I still go to the Andover Newton campus every once in a while. This is their last year there. And I go to see friends and colleagues, and every time it's sad. Like I'm saying goodbye to this home that I thought I could come back to whenever I wanted. I'll admit I remain skeptical about this change. Time will tell if I eventually become part of that late majority or whether I remain a laggard. At the same time, I know that that change is already in motion and that there are certainly people who are excited about it. The leaders of the school have leapt that chasm, gathering the 20% they need to take this bold step. And it's certainly not the first time in its history that Andover Newton has undergone a major change. In fact, and this is my favorite thing about the school, Andover Seminary actually began as a conservative backlash to the spread of Unitarianism at Harvard. Way back in the early 1800s. And in 1931, it moved to share a campus with an American Baptist school called Newton Theological Institute. 30 years later, the two schools formally merged to create Andover Newton Theological School. In the 190 years that a theological school has occupied that hill in Newton Center, the shape and size of the campus has changed too many times to count. Change, as we know, is inevitable. As Octavia Butler writes in The Parable of the Sower, the only lasting truth is change. We are, all of us, works in progress, both as individuals and as an institution. We are not yet finished. And in fact, we never fully become finished products. Now, one thing I know about this congregation is that there has been a lot of change in the past 5 years. And we're about to undergo this new big change, saying goodbye to Sandra, who has been a fabulous interim director of faith formation, right? And welcoming a new settled director of faith formation who will be equally as fabulous, but in her own unique way. I know that some of you are wishing for a chance to catch your breaths from all this change. Others are eager for things to speed up, impatient with the speed of church. And a lot of you are just riding this wave of change, grateful to be part of a vital, loving, and evolving faith community. As we continue to ride this wave of change together, I wonder what it might be like if those of us at the extreme ends of the bell curve took a step back. If you are one of those who's feeling impatient and wishing we would just get on with it, take a breath. And open your heart to those who may be feeling disoriented or unsure. Not that we ought to be held back entirely, but just to take the time to notice and acknowledge that those feelings are valid and real. And to you who are wishing you could put the brakes on, remember that we need the crocus-minded ones, sticking their necks out because they believe in spring. Not that we ought to blindly follow any old change that comes around, but just to remember that their excitement and passion is needed. As the poem says, somebody has to stick their neck out, somebody who cares enough to think through and work through hard ground. Change is hard, and our communal reactions to change are predictable enough to put them on a bell curve. But that doesn't mean that we simply have to stand still in those reactions. We can choose to open our hearts to one another. We can choose to open our hearts to the future that awaits us. We can choose to work together in hope that some of these changes might lead to true transformation. Who knows who we will become together as we take this next step on our journey.